3 professional killers. 1 billionaire CEO. 0 security. It should have been a massacre at Le Bernardin restaurant. Instead, a man in a server's uniform emerged from the shadows and did the impossible. In 4 seconds, 3 bodies hit the floor. The security footage has 40 million views. But the real story isn't the fight, it's what happened when the CEO's assistant looked into the hero's eyes. Arthur Flynn carried himself like a man trying to disappear into his own shadow, though at 6 feet 2 inches, with shoulders that still bore the unmistakable architecture of military conditioning, true invisibility remained forever out of reach. 34 years had carved lines around eyes that had seen too much eyes, that now spent most of their time watching an 8-year-old girl named Adelaide master multiplication tables and negotiate extra bedtime stories. His hands, which once assembled rifles in pitch darkness and steadied ropes on midnight insertions, now wielded industrial dishwashers and silver polish in the back rooms of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. The transition from Navy SEAL Team 6 to single father had been neither gradual nor voluntary. It had been torn from him the day cancer stole Catherine from their small apartment, leaving him with a daughter who had her mother's golden hair and his own stubborn chin. He worked nights when Adelaide stayed with Mrs. Chen next door, an arrangement that allowed him to walk her to school each morning and help with homework each afternoon. The restaurant job paid enough to keep them in their Queens apartment, far from his former life's chaos, far from questions he never wanted to answer. His supervisor knew him as quiet, reliable Arthur who never missed shifts and never complained about staying late. The waitstaff barely noticed him at all, which was exactly how he preferred it. Callista Evelyn moved through the corporate world like a blade through silk, smooth, precise, leaving barely a ripple in her wake. At 33, she had mastered the art of being indispensable while remaining largely invisible, the kind of woman who could defuse a billion-dollar lawsuit with a phone call, but whom security guards still occasionally asked for identification. Her wardrobe consisted entirely of colors that whispered rather than shouted: charcoal, navy, pearl. And she wore her dark hair in a style that suggested authority without demanding attention. Behind her composure lay a childhood spent watching her mother work 3 jobs after her father's heart gave out when she was 7. Experiences that taught her to value security above romance, stability above adventure. She had tried love once, with a banker named Marcus, who promised her everything and delivered nothing except a broken engagement, and the realization that she functioned better alone. Now she channeled all that unused tenderness into managing Bernard Carter's impossible schedule and impossible moods, organizing his life with the devotion of a curator tending priceless art. Her apartment on the Upper East Side contained exactly 3 personal photographs and 17 books about leadership, though she secretly downloaded romance novels onto her tablet late at night, when the city lights looked particularly lonely through her floor-to-ceiling windows. Bernard Carter commanded boardrooms the way generals commanded armies, though lately he found victories tasted more like ash than champagne. At 45, he had built Carter Industries from his father's failing textile company into a multinational corporation worth $12 billion. But success had cost him 2 marriages and any relationship with his younger brother, who had died in a skiing accident while Bernie closed a merger in Tokyo. He treated human connections like hostile takeovers, something to be won or lost, never simply experienced. Only Callista seemed to understand the peculiar rhythm of his loneliness, bringing him coffee exactly 4 minutes before he realized he needed it, scheduling his days to include brief moments of solitude between conquests. He occupied the corner table at Le Bernardin every Thursday evening, using dinner meetings as fortification against the empty penthouse that awaited him. Tonight's dinner with Japanese investors was supposed to secure funding for Southeast Asian expansion, another victory to stack upon victories that had long since ceased to matter. The men who entered the restaurant moved with the coordinated purpose of a pack, and Bernie's mind, always calculating odds and exits, recognized danger in the half-second before the first fist flew toward his face. The attack unfolded with choreographed violence, as if the 3 men had rehearsed this moment in empty warehouses and darkened lots. The first attacker, broad-shouldered with a spider-web tattoo creeping up his neck, grabbed Bernie by his Italian lapels and yanked him from his chair, sending aged whiskey in a crystal tumbler cascading across white linen. The second man, leaner but faster, drove a knee toward Bernie's ribs while the third circled behind, cutting off escape routes with the patience of someone who had done this before. Callista, seated to Bernie's left, found herself shoved backward, her chair toppling as her hands instinctively reached for Bernie, even as physics and momentum carried her away from him. The Japanese investors scrambled backward, one elderly gentleman falling hard against marble, his glasses skittering across the floor like frightened insects. Screams erupted from nearby tables as diners abandoned $1,000 meals, designer heels clicking frantically toward exits that suddenly seemed impossibly distant. Arthur had been transferring clean glasses from the service station when peripheral motion triggered instincts that 5 years of civilian life hadn't quite managed to bury. His body moved before conscious thought, engaged the kind of muscle memory that lived in bone and sinew rather than mind. The first attacker never saw him coming. Arthur's palm strike connected with the man's solar plexus, with the precise force needed to drop without killing, followed by an elbow to the temple that guaranteed unconsciousness without permanent damage. The second attacker managed to turn, managed to throw a wild haymaker that would have been devastating had it connected with anything except air. Arthur slipped inside the arc, his hands finding pressure points with medical precision, and the man crumpled like a marionette with severed strings. The third man reached for something inside his jacket, knife or gun. It didn't matter because Arthur's foot swept his legs while simultaneously controlling the weapon arm, a move practiced 10,000 times in dust and mud and blood. The man's head met marble with a sound like a dropped melon, and then silence descended, except for the crystalline tinkle of a still-spinning wine glass and Callista's sharp intake of breath. Police sirens wailed through Manhattan streets, while Arthur stood among 3 unconscious bodies, his breathing barely elevated, his shirt still tucked, looking for all the world like a man waiting for a bus, rather than someone who had just prevented an execution. The responding officers approached him with the wary respect reserved for dangerous things, temporarily allied with their purpose. He answered their questions with military brevity. Yes, he had intervened. No, he didn't know the attackers. Yes, he was uninjured, while his mind calculated the media attention this would generate and what it might mean for Adelaide. When reporters burst through the doors, he turned his back to their cameras and requested to give his statement away from the crowd. Callista watched him navigate the chaos with fascinating calm, noting how he positioned himself to keep exits visible, how his hands never quite relaxed even as he projected perfect control. Bernie, holding a cloth napkin to a split lip, kept staring at Arthur like he was trying to solve an equation that shouldn't exist. This man who moved like special forces but dressed like service staff, who had saved his life, then tried to vanish into the background, as if heroism was something to be ashamed of. When the detective finally released him, Arthur slipped out through the kitchen exit, but not before Callista memorized the way he walked, controlled, purposeful, carrying invisible weight. The video surfaced online within 3 hours, shot on someone's phone from behind an overturned table, showing only Arthur's back and the fluid destruction he visited upon 3 larger men. By morning, it had 7 million views and climbing. Adelaide discovered it when her friend Emma showed her during lunch. And Arthur's heart nearly stopped when she came home that afternoon, eyes shining with pride and confusion. "Daddy, is this you?" she asked, holding up the tablet with small hands that trembled slightly. He knelt to her level, brushing golden hair from her face, and told her yes, it was him, but it was nothing special, just helping someone who needed help. The way they helped Mrs. Chen with her groceries. She hugged him then, fierce and sudden, whispering, "I knew you were a superhero." And he held her while something inside his chest cracked like ice in spring. Callista appeared at his apartment building 2 days later, having obtained his address through methods she didn't care to elaborate upon. She found him in the small playground behind the complex, pushing Adelaide on a swing while autumn light painted everything gold. He saw her coming, of course he did, but didn't run, just kept pushing the swing in steady rhythm while Adelaide sang a song about butterflies. "Mr. Flynn," Callista said when she was close enough to speak without shouting, "I wanted to thank you properly." He glanced at her, taking in the designer coat and shoes worth more than his monthly rent. The careful way she stood on grass, like she was afraid of leaving footprints. "No thanks necessary," he replied, his voice carrying the hint of an accent that suggested southern origins beneath the neutral tone. Adelaide twisted on the swing to look at the pretty lady, and something in her 8-year-old assessment must have passed muster because she announced, "I'm Adelaide, and this is my daddy, and he's really strong." Callista smiled then, the first genuine expression Arthur had seen from her, and introduced herself with a gravity that made Adelaide giggle. Bernie's summons came through official channels. A courier-delivered letter, on company letterhead, requesting Arthur's presence at Carter Industries headquarters, the tone carefully balanced between invitation and command. Arthur stood in the 43rd floor office, surrounded by glass and chrome and modern art that cost more than houses, feeling underdressed in his only suit, while Bernie paced behind a desk the size of a small boat. The offer was predictable money for silence, a better job for cooperation, the standard corporate response to inconvenient heroism. "I'm not interested in your money," Arthur said, his voice flat as Kansas prairie. "I just want to be left alone." Bernie stopped pacing, genuinely surprised by someone refusing 6 figures like it was spare change. "Everyone wants something," Bernie insisted. But Arthur was already moving toward the door. "My daughter wants her father home safe every night. That's all I want too." Callista, who had been silent in the corner, stood as he passed, and he caught something in her expression, recognition maybe, or understanding, before he disappeared into the elevator. Their second meeting was unplanned, at least on Arthur's part. He was shopping for Adelaide's Halloween costume when Callista appeared in the seasonal aisle, looking hilariously out of place among plastic pumpkins and polyester ghosts. "Let me guess," she said, examining a princess costume with anthropological interest. "Adelaide wants to be a warrior?" He almost smiled. "A ninja, actually. Says princesses can't do backflips." They walked the aisles together, discussing the practical limitations of various costume choices, and Arthur found himself relaxing incrementally, the way he once had during those rare ceasefires, when enemy combatants would share cigarettes across no man's land. She told him about Bernie's paranoia since the attack, the increased security that made her feel more trapped than safe. He found himself telling her about Adelaide's mother, just fragments her laugh, her love of terrible reality television, the way she faced death with more courage than he'd seen in Medal winners. By the time they reached the parking lot, something had shifted between them. Some invisible barrier worn thin enough to see through. The investigation into the attack revealed what Arthur had suspected from the beginning. This wasn't random violence, but targeted retribution. The 3 men had connections to a competitor Bernie had crushed in a hostile takeover 2 years prior, a family company whose patriarch had committed suicide after losing everything. Bernie increased his security detail, hired a private investigation firm, turned his life into a fortress. But fortresses, Arthur knew from experience, only worked if you never had to leave them. The second attempt came 3 weeks later. A sniper's bullet through Bernie's office window while he was in a bathroom break, saved by simple biological timing. The shooter vanished before security could respond, leaving only a message carved into the roof access door. "This isn't over," Bernie called Arthur that night, not through lawyers or assistants but directly, his voice stripped of its usual corporate armor. "I need your help," he said, and Arthur heard what it cost him to admit that. "I can pay." "It's not about money," Arthur interrupted. "If I do this, it's to end it. Permanently. And you follow my rules, not yours." Arthur's integration into Bernie's security detail was intentionally subtle officially. He was a consultant reviewing protocols, which explained his presence without advertising his true role. He identified 17 vulnerabilities in the first day, from predictable routes to compromised personnel, presenting his findings with the emotional investment of someone reading a grocery list. But it was Callista who became his unexpected ally, providing insights into Bernie's stubborn routines and the corporate landscape that bred these vendettas. They spent hours in secure conference rooms, mapping threats and countermeasures, and Arthur discovered she possessed a tactical mind that would have served well in intelligence work. She learned to read his micro-expressions, the tiny shifts that indicated concern versus catastrophe. He learned that she hummed Motown when stressed and kept emergency chocolate in her desk's bottom drawer. Adelaide, with a child's intuition, began asking when the pretty lady would visit again, and Arthur found himself without good answers. The third attack was prevented only because Arthur had insisted on varying Bernie's schedule, forcing the CEO to take different cars at different times, sometimes doubling back or switching vehicles mid-route. They caught 2 men planting devices in the parking garage, professionals who said nothing during interrogation, but whose equipment bore hallmarks of military training. Arthur recognized the escalation pattern. This would continue, until someone ended it definitively. He pulled Bernie aside after the arrests, speaking with the quiet intensity that made generals listen. They won't stop. Each failure makes them more desperate, more dangerous. Next time they might go after people you care about. Bernie's eyes flicked to where Callista was coordinating with federal agents, and Arthur saw what the CEO would never admit she was his weakness, the one person whose loss would actually wound him. "What do you suggest?" Bernie asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "We make them come to us," Arthur replied. "On our terms, our ground. End it all at once." The trap required delicate orchestration, a supposedly secret board meeting at Bernie's estate. Information leaked through channels they knew were compromised. Security, obviously, but not suspiciously reduced. Arthur positioned Adelaide with Mrs. Chen's sister in New Jersey, far from any possible danger, telling her he had important work that would keep him away for just one night. She hugged him goodbye with the solemnity of someone who understood without being told that this was different from his usual absences. The estate sprawled across 40 acres of Westchester County, a monument to success that felt more like a museum than a home. Callista arrived in the early evening, having insisted on being present, despite Arthur's objections. "If something happens to Bernie, I need to be here," she said, with the kind of finality that ended arguments. They waited in Bernie's study, a room lined with first editions no one read and awards no one cared about, while Arthur monitored approaches through cameras he'd personally installed. Bernie paced, unused to being bait, while Callista sat perfectly still, her composure belying the white knuckles gripping her phone. They came at 2 in the morning. Not 3 men this time, but 7. Moving through the grounds with professional coordination. Arthur watched them on monitors, recognizing military movement patterns, hand signals that spoke of shared training. The leader was new, a scarred man with dead eyes, whom the files identified as Silas, a former security contractor with Bernie's company, who'd been terminated for selling industrial secrets. This wasn't just about money or revenge anymore. This was personal vendetta wrapped in professional execution. Arthur activated predetermined protocols, sealing certain areas while leaving others invitingly open, funneling the attackers toward the main house's east wing where he'd prepared his reception. He handed Callista a secured phone, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Stay with Bernie. Lock the safe room door. Don't open it for anyone except me, and only after I give you the code word." She nodded, and impulsively, so quickly he almost missed it, touched his hand. "Be careful," she whispered. And he allowed himself one moment to squeeze her fingers before moving toward the darkness where violence waited. The first 2 never saw him coming, dropped by precise strikes from shadows they hadn't thought to check. The third managed a muffled shout before Arthur's arm wrapped around his throat, a blood choke that brought unconsciousness in seconds without permanent damage. But Silas had heard something, and suddenly the careful plan fractured into chaos. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes strobing through darkness as Arthur rolled behind marble statuary that exploded into dust and fragments. He moved through the house with liquid efficiency, using architecture as weapon doors slammed into faces. Stairs became gravity-assisted takedowns. A decorative sword from Bernie's collection found new purpose. The 4th and 5th attackers tried to flank him through the kitchen, but Arthur had fought in tighter spaces with worse odds. He used their coordination against them, forcing them into each other's lines of fire, creating confusion where there had been precision. A knife appeared in his hand, he couldn't remember pulling it, and then one attacker was screaming, clutching a precisely severed tendon that would heal, but never quite the same. Silas was different from the others, trained, experienced, personal stakes, making him dangerous in ways money couldn't buy. They faced each other in the main foyer, circling beneath a chandelier that cast prismatic light across marble floors now streaked with blood. "You don't know what he did," Silas said, his voice gravel and rage. "He destroyed everything. Left good people with nothing." Arthur kept his breathing steady, cataloging injuries, bruised ribs, possible fracture in his left hand, shallow knife wound bleeding through his shirt. "I know what you're doing won't fix it," Arthur replied, shifting weight to accommodate the damage. Silas attacked with the fury of someone with nothing left to lose, and for the first time that night, Arthur found himself genuinely tested. They crashed through furniture, trading strikes that would have killed lesser men. A brutal ballet, that left both bloodied and gasping. In the end, it was Adelaide who saved him, not her presence but her memory. The need to return to her, overwhelming any acceptance of defeat. When Silas made his final error, a telegraphed haymaker born of exhaustion and fury, Arthur ended it with a combination that left the man unconscious but breathing, because Adelaide had asked him once if he had ever killed anyone, and he'd been able to say no, not since leaving the service. The safe room door opened to his code word. Adelaide and Callista emerged first, taking in his injuries with eyes that catalogued everything while revealing nothing. Then she was moving, finding first aid supplies with efficiency that suggested preparation, cleaning wounds while Bernie called authorities with shaking hands. "You're hurt," she said unnecessarily, her fingers gentle on his split knuckles. "I've had worse," he replied, which was true but irrelevant. She worked in silence while sirens approached, and when she was done, when the immediate damage was addressed, she did something unexpected. She leaned against him, just slightly, her weight warm against his uninjured side. "Thank you," she whispered, and he understood she meant not just for tonight but for all of it, for being the kind of man who could do what was necessary without becoming the darkness he fought. Federal agents arrived with the sunrise, taking custody of Silas and the others, beginning the investigation that would eventually reveal a conspiracy reaching into Bernie's own board of directors. The mole, Bernie's own head of security who'd been selling information and access, was arrested at the airport trying to flee to a non-extradition country. Bernie held a press conference a week later, against legal advice but with Arthur's reluctant agreement, publicly thanking the man who'd saved his life twice and prevented what could have been a corporate assassination. Arthur stood in the background, uncomfortable in borrowed suit and media attention, but understanding this was necessary for closure. When reporters asked about his background, he gave them just enough: former military, single father, doing what anyone would do to satisfy without exposing. Callista managed the narrative with subtle expertise, ensuring Adelaide remained unmentioned and unphotographed, protecting what Arthur valued most. The aftermath was quieter than any of them expected. Bernie returned to his corporate world with new appreciation for the people who protected it, implementing security changes that went beyond personnel to include corporate culture shifts that might prevent creating future enemies. He offered Arthur a permanent position, head of security, 6 figures, benefits that would secure Adelaide's future through college and beyond. Arthur declined with characteristic simplicity. "I'm not a corporate man," he said, and Bernie had the wisdom not to push. But something else emerged from those conversations: unexpected and unspoken respect between men who had seen each other at extremes, who understood that courage came in different forms. Bernie started showing up at Adelaide's school plays, claiming he was in the neighborhood, fooling no one. He became Uncle Bernie by Christmas, the lonely executive finding something like family in a kitchen that smelled of homework and home cooking rather than corporate dinners and calculated conversations. Callista's presence in their lives evolved with organic inevitability, beginning with coffee after Adelaide's parent-teacher conferences, progressing to Saturday museum trips, where she proved surprisingly knowledgeable about dinosaurs and ancient Egypt. She never pushed, never assumed, just existed in their orbit with patient gravity until her absence felt more notable than her presence. Adelaide appointed herself matchmaker with 8-year-old subtlety, which is to say none at all, engineering scenarios that required Callista's assistance, suddenly developing interest in subjects that required bookstore visits, discovering urgent needs for feminine perspective on school projects. Arthur watched his daughter bloom under female attention, saw her unconsciously mimicking Callista's graceful gestures and thoughtful pauses, and felt something in his chest that had been frozen since Catherine's death begin its slow, painful thaw. The first dinner invitation came from Adelaide, naturally, delivered with the formal solemnity of a diplomatic summit. "Miss Callista, would you like to have dinner with us? Daddy's making spaghetti, and he only burns the garlic sometimes." Callista's eyes found Arthur's across the playground, where this negotiation was occurring, and he nodded once, surrendering to inevitability disguised as childhood manipulation. She arrived that evening with homemade brownies and a bottle of wine that cost more than their entire meal. But she sat at their small table like she belonged there, helping Adelaide with her math homework while Arthur cooked, filling space that had been empty so long they'd stopped noticing its shape. After Adelaide fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from excitement and too much dessert, they sat on the fire escape watching Queens pretend to be Manhattan, sharing the wine and silence that said more than words could manage. She misses having a mother, Arthur said eventually, not looking at Callista but feeling her attention like warmth. She doesn't remember Catherine much, just impressions, perfume, lullabies, the feeling of being held. I try. But there are things I can't be for her. Things I don't even know she needs. Until I see her watching other girls with their mothers. Callista was quiet for a long moment, processing implications and possibilities with the same care she brought to billion-dollar negotiations. I miss having a family, she replied finally. I've been so focused on being necessary that I forgot about being wanted. Bernie needs me to function, but Adelaide, she just wants me around. There's a difference. Arthur turned to look at her then, seeing past the professional polish to something raw and real underneath, and made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks ago. We want you around, he said simply. Both of us. The progression was slow, careful. Two people who had been hurt, learning to trust not just each other but the possibility of happiness that didn't come with conditions or expiration dates. Callista kept her apartment, but gradually migrated belongings. A toothbrush, then work clothes. Then the comfortable pajamas she wore when Adelaide demanded movie nights. Arthur learned her coffee preferences, her hatred of mornings, the way she hummed when happy and went silent when stressed. She learned his nightmares, the ones where he couldn't save everyone, and how to bring him back without making him feel weak. Adelaide absorbed it all, with the adaptability of childhood, adjusting to Callista's presence like a plant turning towards sun. Natural and necessary. The three of them developed rhythms, Sunday breakfasts that lasted until lunch, homework sessions that became life lessons, bedtime stories that required all three voices for proper dramatization. Bernie watched this evolution with unexpected satisfaction, finding vicarious warmth in their emerging family like a freezing man standing near a fire. He started declining dinner meetings in favor of Adelaide's birthday parties, board conferences for school plays where his goddaughter, because that's what Adelaide had decided he was performed with enthusiasm that exceeded talent. The corporate titan, who had built empires on calculated isolation, discovered that power meant less than Adelaide's hand in his, during scary movie parts, that billion-dollar deals paled beside Callista's genuine smile when he remembered her mother's birthday, that Arthur's rare nod of approval felt more valuable than board validation. He was still alone in his penthouse most nights, still married to work that demanded everything and gave back only numbers, but now he had somewhere to go when the silence got too loud, people who welcomed him without agenda or expectation. 6 months after that night of violence, they gathered for Adelaide's 9th birthday, a small party that somehow included Bernie, Mrs. Chen, Adelaide's best friends from school, and a cake that Arthur had definitely not made himself despite claims otherwise. Callista wore jeans for the first time in Arthur's memory, her professional armor abandoned for something softer, realer. She helped Adelaide open presents with the patience of someone who understood that wrapping paper was half the fun, while Arthur took pictures with an ancient camera that Bernie kept threatening to upgrade. When Adelaide blew out her candles, her wish was loud enough for everyone to hear. I wish we could always be like this, and the adults exchanged glances over her head, silent promises to try. Later, after sugar-crashed children had been collected by parents, and Bernie had left with suspiciously bright eyes and 3 pieces of leftover cake, the 3 of them sat in comfortable exhaustion, Adelaide sprawled across both their laps, fighting sleep with stubborn determination. "Tell me the story," Adelaide demanded, her voice muzzy with approaching dreams, and Arthur began the familiar narrative how he met Callista, carefully edited for young ears, transformed into fairy tale, where the sad knight saved the kingdom, and found the clever princess who helped him remember how to smile. But halfway through, Callista took over. Adding details Arthur hadn't known, she'd noticed how the knight was actually saving everyone long before the dragon appeared, how he made sure everyone got home safe every night, how his strength wasn't in his sword, but in his heart. Adelaide fell asleep before the ending. But they finished it anyway. For themselves. For the truth that lived between words. Arthur carried Adelaide to bed while Callista cleaned up, domestic choreography they'd developed without discussion, and when he returned, she was standing by the window watching the city lights, looking like she belonged there. Like she'd always belonged there. "I love you," she said without turning around. The words, simple, and devastating. Both of you. I didn't mean to, didn't plan it, but somewhere between dinosaur museums and burned garlic, it happened anyway. Arthur crossed to her in 3 strides, turning her to face him, seeing his own terrified hope reflected in her eyes. "Catherine would have liked you," he said, which was its own kind of declaration. She would have said you were too good for me, too smart, too everything, and she would have been right. But she also would have told me to stop being an idiot and kiss you already. So he did, there in his small kitchen with dishes still in the sink and Adelaide's artwork covering the refrigerator, kissing her like a man who'd forgotten he was allowed happiness, who was remembering it all at once. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, she smiled, with a radiance that transformed her face. "So what now?" she asked, and he pulled her close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, steady and sure. "Now we do what Adelaide wished for," he said. "We stay like this, always." The wedding was small, just as they wanted Adelaide as flower girl and ring bearer and maid of honor all at once. Bernie giving Callista away with tears he blamed on allergies. Mrs. Chen crying openly in the front row. They exchanged vows in the botanical gardens, where Adelaide had first decided Callista was acceptable, promises that acknowledged the past while embracing the future. Arthur spoke of finding light in unexpected places, of second chances that felt like first choices. Callista talked about discovering that home wasn't a place but people, that love wasn't just romantic movie moments but homework help and burned dinners and someone who made you feel safe enough to be yourself. Adelaide interrupted the kiss to announce that finally, officially, she had a mom, and the small gathering erupted in laughter that felt like blessing. The reception was in Bernie's garden. His wedding gift was paying for everything, despite protests, and as Arthur watched his wife and daughter dancing badly to music that was probably too loud for the neighbors, he felt Catherine's absence like a gentle presence, approval from whatever came after, permission to be happy without guilt. They moved to a larger apartment in the same building because Adelaide insisted Mrs. Chen was family, and families stayed close. Arthur took a position teaching self-defense at the community center, finding purpose in preparing others without violence being the only option. Callista scaled back her hours with Bernie, who had somehow acquired 3 more assistants to compensate, focusing on consulting work that let her be home for after-school snacks and evening stories. Their life wasn't perfect. Arthur still had nightmares. Callista still struggled with work-life balance. Adelaide still asked about her first mom, with questions that had no easy answers. But it was theirs, built on foundations of choice rather than chance, strength rather than fear. Bernie remained their constant satellite, the uncle-grandfather friend who showed up for Sunday dinners and science fairs, who taught Adelaide about business while she taught him about joy. He never found his own romantic happiness, but he found family in their kitchen, purpose in their milestones, peace in being needed for more than his money or power. Years passed in the rhythm of ordinary magic birthdays and holidays, fights and reconciliations, the small victories and defeats that make a life. Adelaide grew tall and fierce, inheriting Arthur's strength and Callista's intelligence. Catherine's kindness that lived on in gestures she didn't know she was making. She played soccer with her father's intensity and debated with her mother's precision, becoming herself while carrying pieces of all who loved her. Arthur learned to sleep through entire nights, to trust that happiness wasn't a temporary ceasefire but a sustainable peace. Callista discovered that being needed and being loved were different things, that she could be both, that she was enough just as herself. They built traditions, pancakes on Saturdays, movies on Fridays, the story of how they became family told and retold until it became mythology, truth wrapped in love and polished by time. On Adelaide's 18th birthday, as she prepared to leave for college engineering, because she wanted to build things that helped people, they stood together in the same botanical garden where they'd married, watching their daughter take pictures with friends who'd become family, boyfriends who'd been properly terrified by Arthur, teachers who'd been charmed by Callista. Bernie was there, grayer now but still formidable, telling anyone who'd listen about his goddaughter's accomplishments. Mrs. Chen had brought enough food for an army, convinced everyone was too thin. The party swirled around them, but Arthur and Callista stood apart for a moment, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, watching their daughter laugh with the abandon of someone who'd never doubted she was loved. "We did good," Callista said softly, and Arthur pressed a kiss to her temple, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, the comfort of her presence. "We did perfect," he corrected, and she laughed. The sound still capable of stopping his heart after all these years. As the sun set over the garden, painting everything gold and amber, Adelaide found them there, rolling her eyes at their public display of affection but joining their embrace anyway, nearly as tall as Arthur now but still their little girl in ways that mattered. "You know I'm coming home for Thanksgiving, right?" she said, as if they hadn't already planned the menu and argued about turkey versus ham, and Christmas, and probably random weekends when I need real food. Arthur tightened his arms around both his girls. These women who'd saved him in different ways, who'd given him purpose beyond survival, who'd taught him that strength wasn't just about what you could destroy, but what you could protect, what you could build, what you could love. Behind them, Bernie was making a toast, something about family and choice, and the unexpected places we find home. And everyone raised glasses to futures that looked nothing like their pasts, to happiness, that came not from winning, but from refusing to lose what mattered most. The party continued past sunset, lights strung through trees, creating constellation patterns that would feature in Adelaide's memory forever. Arthur stood washing dishes. He always did the dishes, finding meditation in the simple task, while Callista and Adelaide sat at the kitchen table, looking through college supplies, catalogs, debating the necessity of 17 different organizational systems. Bernie dozed in the living room chair, claiming he was just resting his eyes, looking more peaceful than he ever did in boardrooms. This was what Arthur had fought for without knowing it. What he'd been protecting before he knew it existed. Not just the people, but the possibility of them. The chance for broken things to heal stronger, for loneliness to transform into connection. For a man trained in violence to discover that his greatest strength was in his gentleness, his greatest victory in his surrender to love. Outside, the city hummed its eternal song, indifferent to their small happiness. But inside their apartment, in the circle of light that held them together, they were complete. They were family. They were home.